Welcome to today's edition of PSLabor Talk. I'm joined today by Ricardo Torres, President and CEO of Permanent Solutions Labor Consultants. And along with Ricardo, I'm joined by Cliff Hammond of Foster Swift out of Southfield, Michigan. We're going to talk about workplace violence, how important it is. It's in the spotlight right now, the recent shootings, recent acts of violence in our country. And today, and in this point in time, it's very important that employers are addressing the issue. So we're going to dig deep into the subject because it's much more than the mass shootings that we're seeing. The amount of workplace violence that's occurring throughout the country is a staggering amount. And I think as we get into this very important podcast, that the listeners will learn quite a bit about where we actually stand as a country in dealing with violence in the workplace and the different types of violence that are occurring in the workplace. I'm glad to be here with Ricardo and Cliff as we delve into this very important subject matter. Welcome to today's episode of PSLabor Talk. All right, hey, Cliff, I'm going to start with you today. What I want to know is, why is workplace violence becoming such a hot topic now? I mean, obviously, we've seen some things in the news. As soon as we announced that we were working on a workplace violence project, we've gotten a lot of calls here, and we're seeing a lot in the news. What's going on that's different now than a year ago?
Well, a significant difference. I think there's a big movement from a lot of groups to try to put an end to violence just in general. We're seeing a lot of the Me Too movement is putting a spotlight on harassment as well as violence, domestic violence, workplace violence, and I think it is a natural transition to start looking at the way that guns are impeding people's ability to have a safe work environment. And once you start looking at the gun issue, which has now become a prevalent issue with the school shootings that we've seen workplace violence, we see domestic violence, and then we start talking about not only deaths, but then you start taking a look at how people are interacting in the workplace, and people are starting to say, we're tired of seeing people get injured, threatened, and those types of threats being taken lightly. Because I think for years and years, a lot of employers and a lot of workers felt like their concerns weren't actually being met. And so now we're putting a bigger, broader brush on what is acceptable in the workplace and in society in general. And I think we've had a complete transition from what we used to expect out of our workplace to what's now being expected. And that's from a governmental expectation and from societal expectation. So I think there's been a serious shift in what we expect people to do.
Yeah, and for years it's been healthcare and retail have been the most highly susceptible to workplace violence. But now we're starting to focus on manufacturing facilities, which even a year ago they had workplace language that was considered to be acceptable in the workplace. But now we're seeing a shift in that.
The guys be guys, the old let's just, hey, go out in the parking lot and take it out there and, have a fist fight and it's okay, or people just making idle threats and then just saying, we were just joking, or that's just us. Those days actually did occur. Even when people had zero tolerance policies, sometimes it didn't mean zero tolerance.
But Cliff, also is that this is an issue that's so underreported.
Sure.
I mean, you're talking about manufacturing facilities and that are low reported industries, but I'm telling you, it is really prevalent in those industries. It happens all the time, but it's just not being reported.
Yeah, there's 2 million, they approximate 2 million cases per year in the United States.
Yeah.
And that is only the ones that are reported. So how many are there really out
Well, yeah,
there?
and I think Cliff hits it right on the head when he talks about, let boys be boys. And I think that's what really, especially in manufacturing, especially in factories, I think that's one of the biggest issues is that things happen, all the time. And nobody reports it, because if someone reports it, man, their existence in that facility is going to be really tough, because now everybody's going to make fun of them.
Well, that's the thing. I think what's going on now is a seismic shift in what's acceptable in the workplace, because it used to be a lot of managers turned a blind eye to things that happen in the workforce because, look, the goal was get things done, right? If you get the job done, we put out our product, you let off a little steam. As long as at the end of the day nobody gets too hurt, we're okay with it.
Well, and there's two other things though too, Cliff. A lot of times managers are the ones who are browbeating everybody else.
Right.
And on the flip side of the coin also is that I think that they may be scared also because they're the targets. I mean, if you look at the history, I mean the high profile workplace shootings, you'll see that one of the biggest targets or the first targets are the management team.
Sure. Disgruntled employee comes in. We all see that on the news.
Yeah.
Shoots coworkers, but really the target was the boss
Yeah.
who had been browbeating him. But I think that the goal here, when we talk about workplace violence, and Bob talked about it, 2 million incidents a year, and this isn't something new. This just didn't happen last year or this year. We're talking about a situation that's now coming to the forefront of people's minds. But this means not just shootings. We're talking about fights. We're talking about threats, verbal, physical, or any type of intimidation tactic that's happening on the workforce. That's the 2 million. Any one of those incidents, though, could result in a serious issue.
Well, yeah, and I think sexual harassment also is a big issue there. I mean,
if you think about it, 2 million is 5,479 incidents per day.
Right.
I think that's a lowball number. Also, I think it's a lot higher than that. I think that it
Because they don't report it.
they don't report it. A lot of people suffer inside. I know people who I had a lady that worked for me when I was a union official who used to when she gave a presentation, she used to actually cry because remembering what she had to put up on the floor, and then she took it to the union to file a complaint. She took it to management, and they didn't even hear it. They didn't even address it at all. And till a couple of years back, when she was actually working for me, with management, when she would talk about it, she would have tears in her eyes about the experience that she had.
Yeah, the failure to recognize the reality of the problem has made this issue 2 million times, plus how many that aren't reported.
Plus.
The failure of individual employees to bring it to somebody's attention isn't that employees all the time. Sometimes it's because their coworkers pressure them not to do it. Sometimes because the manager ignored them the last time they complained. So years and years of institutionalizing the ability of people to intimidate, harass, bully, based on whatever, has led to this somewhat subculture that allows that to happen in the workplace. And I think that's what we're seeing now is how do we address the big issue, the violent issue we see on TV? Well, systemically, a lot of those happen because we haven't addressed what can be addressed on a very simple process, which is accept people, let them come into the fold, have a system where people feel comfortable bringing their concerns. And then once you know those concerns, you can investigate them and put an end to them, so that you don't get to that level. I think that's what we're trying to get to at this point when we see this movement to say, let's stop this.
Well, I don't think it's ever going to be stopped, but it can be controlled.
Sure.
Because when you're dealing with people and you're dealing with issues, you're never going to stop it. But you have to get it to a point to where it doesn't escalate to a situation to where someone's going to be threatened or actually attacked physically.
And the odds of a fatal occurrence in the workplace are actually very low. The Bureau of Labor and Statistics puts that number at about 400. But it's still very important that people, like Rick said, you can't stop it, but you can reduce the risk, and that's through training. Through drills, just like a fire drill, a tornado drill, earthquake drill.
Bob, but and that's true, spot on. But I also think, and I want to mention that I think that a lot of times living with the threat of violence, even though it doesn't get to the actual physical violence level, I think that a lot of people go on for years living under the threat of violence or harassment within the workplace, and I think that's almost as bad. It's not as bad, of course, but it's on that level.
I like to equate this very closely to auto accidents. You think about every year nearly 40,000 people die in auto accidents, okay? But think about it for a second. Before we started putting mandatory safety measures into vehicle production, seat belts, crash testing, those type of mandatory federal requirements, how many more people would have died? Now, you can't eliminate, there are certain things you're not going to be able to eliminate. There's always going to be that issue you can't. But when you do put appropriate necessary measures, remedial measures in place, you can limit those accidents. Not going to, end everybody from being, maybe a threat or having a bad day where they get into a discussion that goes too far, but it can stop what you can stop. And that's a good start, right? I mean, that's when you start being constructive and you start weeding out the problems faster.
And I think what you're talking about, and I agree, is that it's changing the culture of what is acceptable and non-acceptable. And changing the culture is like turning a battleship, around in the ocean. It takes time, but you have to do it, and it can be done, and it's done all the time. But changing the culture, and I think that's what you were talking about earlier when you said, there's things that are happening now, like with the Me Too and with all these shootings, that people are saying enough is enough. And I think that's part of changing the culture. And we can see it happening and escalating in the speed that it's happening.
And every time there's a shooting, first thing you hear on the news is we're not sure if this is terrorism or not terrorism, right? And the number one cause of workplace violence is actually criminal intent. Terrorism would fall on that, but including armed robbery, trespassing on the property, some kind of altercation with criminal intent. Actually, 85% of cases of some sort of violence with a fatality fall into that category. The second one that people don't think of often, the second most common, is the customer or the client. And you can imagine a customer being upset in certain industries, and like we were talking earlier, Cliff, healthcare. If something happens to one of your loved ones, that can easily escalate.
Well, emotion becomes a bigger problem than people expect in these type of situations. When you have access from the public into your work environment, and it's a retail establishment, it's a hospital, it's a healthcare industry where people are coming in and out, you don't know what those individuals are bringing to the table. And if you've got a natural emotional component like a healthcare facility, things can happen quickly. So that's why training is important, how to de-escalate, how to have these problems resolved, not only with your employees, but with your third parties that come into contact with your employees, because that could raise a violence issue. Whether it's a gun, or whether it's just a fight, or whether it's a threat of violence, these things need to be addressed so that we can talk to people intelligently to try to train them to avoid these situations.
And the bigger issue, and I think that what happens is that people react on their emotions. People don't know how to control their emotions, and that gets into another whole mental health, situation that I think that has to be discussed at some point in time also. And I think that what we're talking about is emotional issues. And I think that, what happens is that, with emotional health or with mental health situation and the lack of funding, which is a whole nother discussion, but I think that people react on their emotions. People react on their anger if they feel disrespected. And that's a whole nother cultural change that people have to look at, is that how people, as you said, Cliff, de-escalate. I mean, it's just like, road rage. How many things happen on the road, on the expressways, because someone makes a lane turn without a indicator, or cut someone off, and next thing you know, people are ramming each other and chasing each other and getting into fist fights. It just explodes. It gets crazy, and that's the same thing in the work facilities. But how do you stop those emotions from chiming up in the first place? And that's what's hard. But knowing how to, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and having people who can read into that. Mm-hmm. And can get in front of that and to de-escalate it, as you said.
And a big problem is without the training, you don't know how to de-escalate, because in the real world, if you're out on the street and you're not thinking about actually de-escalating the problem, you're thinking about over-shouting somebody, over-posturing somebody, trying to show that you're in a superior offensive mode. In the workplace, how many times have we been in a workplace where the supervisor is doing just that, trying to overshout an angry employee to calm him down? He has no training, and that's a big problem, and it's happening all over the country.
I don't think the supervisor, in most of the cases, Bob, are shouting out at the employee to calm him down. He's shouting at the employee to intimidate him or to force his position on the employee and make a point to the other employees that are standing around or working around the same area. Hey, don't mess with me, just do what I say. And that's exactly the wrong way to handle those situations.
From a legal perspective, every employer has an obligation under OSHA to provide a workplace that's free of recognizable hazards. So that's the first place that you should start as an employer. You have to look at your workplace. You got to assess what your problems are and find out if there are problems. And one thing that you can look at is, obviously, we say, okay, we have people walking in and out of here and we know they have guns. Is that a recognizable hazard? Maybe. Okay, that's one right there, depending on what. Maybe if you're in a prison, that might be something that's necessary. But if you're in a manufacturing setting and you've got people with guns, depending on your state, you might be able to regulate that. But it doesn't stop there. A lot of employers will look over the way their managers are treating people and the way that the responses are coming back. And if the process that they have in place is being completely ignored as far as zero tolerance toward intimidation and harassment, are they tracking on an annual basis how they're addressing the supervisors? How are you training people to communicate? How are you training employees to communicate? If they've got a problem with their supervisor, is there another avenue, another person that they can talk to and bring their issue? These are simple ways that you can address a potentially hazardous workplace that might not even meet the legal standard for a hazardous workplace, but a common sense approach would say, if you're not doing a yearly audit of the problems in your workplace, you may be allowing yourself to be open to intimidation, harassment, violence, and maybe even something that could potentially be a life-threatening situation.
And I think that the problem with that, Cliff, is that there's many companies that are decentralized management styles. It's a top-down, and they don't really, in many cases, they don't understand what's happening on the floor of the work facility, whether it's a hospital or a plant. It doesn't matter. A lot of them don't understand what's happening on the floor of these issues until it gets to the point to where they can't ignore it anymore. Mm-hmm. And by that time, it might be too late. Something drastic could happen.
Now, if you move away from just this is what you should do for the employee, from an employer standpoint, there are potential liabilities that you're sitting there on. Sure. So from OSHA, okay, or a state level OSHA program, you could be fined, and there could be criminal sanctions if people do things. So you have to understand, failing to address these issues, not in a life-threatening situation, but just somebody going out and getting into an argument, a fist fight, a physical, that could lead to a one-time fine for a single incident, which has some limitations. But if it's systemic, or if it's something that was ignored and allowed to go on, there could be serious penalties. And we've seen the criminalization of the OSHA process, and it's risen over the last couple of years now, where you could find yourself in a problem. Now, an individual employee doesn't have a private right of action. They can't file their own lawsuit for violation of OSHA. But the government can come in, and they can seek penalties. And it's very important that if you don't have a process in place to try to abate this, and if you go on to OSHA's website, they actually have for certain industries, they have plans of actions you can take a look at, and it's a great start. They're not required, but they're a good start to look at. But as a company, you said this, a lot of companies are, they're decentralized. But the key here is, even if you're decentralized, you should have a place-made, individualized assessment for a workforce violence prevention program in place, because that's what's required of you. You've got to protect your employees from a civil and a criminal standpoint. That's required, just as a baseline.
And even beyond the legal responsibilities that you have, it should be a moral responsibility that you should want to take up and want to look at, because it's going to affect your bottom line no matter what, but you have the responsibility, the management has the responsibility to ensure that their workforce is safe and feels safe coming into the facility.
Now, I think that's the key to Bob asked in the beginning. What's the difference now? Because the legal requirements have always been there, right?
Yes.
And people have been hit for $500,000 or more, millions of dollars, quite frankly, for non-deadly attacks in the workplace, where they knew about an issue, retained an employee, they came back against the employee and caused damage, caused harms, and depending on what state and what the circumstances were, it could be serious penalties, but some employers just didn't change. The change really is coming from a societal standpoint of addressing, is this too much? Are we tired of this happening?
Well, and a lot of times what happens, Cliff, is that when a company finds out that there are potentially issues that are going on that they could be held responsible for. A lot of times companies, instead of saying, hey, let's open this up and address it and let's deal with it, they say, okay, let's try to limit our liabilities.
Right.
and that's where the culture change has to come in. That's where it has to happen.
Really, it's got to start in the very first day an employee starts work. It has to start in orientation. And unfortunately, some of the orientations that we've reviewed, and Cliff, I'm sure you've seen some, I really don't believe they're hitting it hard enough.
No, I don't disagree with you, because one of the problems is that there's a patchwork system that sometimes is put into place, or nothing. How many times have you gone into an employer setting, you say, let me take a look at your policies, let me take a look at your handbook. They don't have a workplace violence policy. They don't have the type of policies that you would expect for a company. Maybe it's because they've grown from a small shop to a big place, or they're a big company and they're afraid to put a policy in place because they're afraid if they don't adhere to it, somebody's going to sue them based on that. So they just say, the heck with it. Or they've got a policy that was made a long time ago, but they never applied it. So they don't even run over it. Or they just give somebody a copy of it when they have orientation, and that's it. They don't actually train them.
Well, yeah, that's the point, Cliff. I think it looks nice in a handbook. It looks nice, on a piece of paper. This is our policy, and we, this is our philosophy and how we treat each other. But to actually implement that policy and follow up on it and make sure that it sticks is a whole nother issue. It's a whole nother thing.
And another one that I see is the policy actually states that someone that has an altercation has an opportunity to go to anger management type training.
Right.
Well, the reason that from the discussions I've had with some of the clients that we deal with is because they have a hard time retaining employees and they need to have the employee back. Well, you got to understand, anger management training is not going to work on anyone or everyone, and you still may have a high risk in your facility. So I would recommend that you look at that very closely.
Well, you have to make this part of the corporate DNA as far as safety and as far as protecting your workforce. You have to make that part of your DNA, the corporate DNA. If you don't take it as seriously as it deserves to be taken, then you're going to fall back, and you're not going to be up on top of it.
It's not easy. It's one of the problems that you get at the end of the day is why hasn't this become just standard operating procedure? Because it's not a one-off situation. You can't simply say, we're going to have an orientation, you're going to sign a sheet, you're going to have a 5-minute training, and that's it. It's just not that simple. There are a lot of vagaries that go on with this stuff, and it has to evolve over time. You have a workforce that's doing different jobs. You have different people to come in and out of your workforce. You could have 20 years of not a single violent person that comes in, not a single problem at all. Then all of a sudden, one of those employees has been there that entire time, starts exhibiting different behavior. And you've got to address it, because there are a lot of laws that come into play. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can't fire somebody because you think, quote unquote, they're crazy. But there's a difference between somebody being perceived as crazy and making a threatening statement. So you can't just simply have that simple, analysis. It's got to actually be something that you put a commitment to put time into to make this work.
Well, it's just like when you see on the news that someone has just shot up their workplace, or someone went into a school and shot up the school. And you see people will come on, wow, we're so surprised because this is not him. I mean, because they didn't know him. And that's the same thing within the work facility. That's why it's so important for that frontline supervisor to know who their people are, so they can see if there's issues that are happening, or if there's issues that have always been there. Oh, well, you know what? I'm not going to deal with it because it's easier for me just to go through my day and not have to be concerned about the issues that are happening to my employees on the ground. So having a workforce, especially a frontline supervisor workforce, educated and caring about what's going on within his unit is extremely important also, because that's where it's caught. That's where it's followed up, right there.
And one statistic, and it hits what Rick just said exactly on the head, 4 out of 10 supervisors reported that they knew about some kind of trouble or some kind of behavior change or some kind of sign that there could be a problem after the incident happened and didn't report it. I mean, some of the things that we're looking for is a change. I mean, you might have a star employee and all of a sudden his production levels are at an all-time low. The employee's coming to the supervisor talking about problems with his home life. problems with his finances, problems with dealing with deaths in the family, things that will trigger some kind of an emotional trip in the brain.
And that's one of the biggest causes. But in communication, there's two sides of that coin of communication. Being able to say what the proper things to say for the circumstances. But what's even more important, the flip side of that coin, is how to listen to what people are really saying. And
Absolutely, because one of the things that we teach in the training that we do is take the time to actively listen. Shut everything out. If someone comes to you with those kind of problems, shut everything out. The noise of the machines, the telephones that are ringing. Bring them into a quiet spot. Take the time, speak to them, let them get it off the chest, and reassure them that you hear them and you're there for them. Now, sometimes you may not be able to do anything to help them, but at least he's been heard, she's been heard, and knows where to go for help.
Well, and I think that is helping them. I think that someone listening to someone and letting them get it off their chest, I think, is extremely important. And it's in situations also when there's possible layoffs, or an industry is the economic situation is not so good. They're worried about it, or they have a couple of write-ups and they might get some time off. People have to take those opportunities to talk to people, to give them, okay, if, for instance, someone has a couple of write-ups, they're facing maybe some time off if they have another issue. Take them in and talk to them and tell them how that, help them understand how that they can change and move and turn it around. It's not hopeless. They're not in a downward spiral.
That's why you have a process in place.
That's why you have a process.
That's why you have a process. Employees need to know, if I have an issue, here's what the issues are, here's who I take it to. And then from a management system, you have to know, here's how I address employees who bring a concern. You can't simply tell employees to bring a problem to somebody who hasn't been trained. You've got to train the employee who's going to receive the issue, whether it's a frontline supervisor, or at least if they're not trained, tell them, look, that's a good concern. I don't handle that, but let me tell you who you should go to.
Someone needs to be able to coach them back. Coach them, okay, if you want to change it, you want to get on a better footing, then this is how we coach you back.
And then that's why the EAP process, Bob talked about the EAP process. That's something that a lot of employers have put into place, not just for anger, but for concerns that people have. It's an opportunity. There's material that you can put out. And again, there's an annualized assessment that should be done. What are the issues that have come up? How have we addressed those issues? What have we done? Now, again, there are ADA requirements. There's certain personal issues. We can't ask certain questions of people about disabilities and things of that nature. But at the end of the day, we can listen. We can have a system in place. And 40%, we're literally talking about almost half of these type of incidents, Bob, that you were talking about, maybe could have been prevented, or at least there could have been a warning sign that if it reported, could have led us to a better outcome or an opportunity to know what was going on at a higher level to take some sort of intervention. So that's a problem.
And you just talked about ADA. So here's a question for you from a legal standpoint. If you have an employee that you've dealt with for years and you notice a drastic change in a short period of time, are you allowed to confront the employee, ask the employee what's going on and what can we do for you?
Well, the first thing you have to know is you can't take an adverse action, suspend somebody, take them off of work because of a disability. So a mental impairment, or even thinking somebody has a mental impairment, is actually a protected classification under the ADA. But that doesn't mean that if a person engages in types of behavior that are direct threats, there are exceptions that you can do that. But even before you get to those theories, if somebody starts having erratic behavior as far as attendance now, is all of a sudden their attendance is off the charts, not there. They're having poor ability to communicate with people, whereas they've been a stellar employee before. It's okay to go to the person and say, hey, I've noticed your attendance is off. Is there a problem? I've noticed that you now have this issue with another employee. What is the concern? Is there anything that we can do for you to help you out? Those are legitimate things that you can do that are not violation of anybody's rights. And the person might be able to explain to you, I'm tired of this person bullying me. I'm just tired of that person because I don't like them. I'm tired of this person because I got problems in my outside life. That's when you say, whoever it is asking the question, say, well, here's our process. Whether it be, I just want you to know that we have an access to an EAP program. It's free of charge, or it's covered under our policy, or whatever it is. If they need leave, you have a leave policy. Just want you to know that we have a system. You can talk with so-and-so at HR or whatever if they need time off. So if you have paid or unpaid time, if they're qualified for some sort of family medical leave or other leave, or if they need an accommodation, that's how the process starts. The communication starts with somebody identifying what the issues are. Changes in somebody's behavior in the workplace that's work-related is significant enough concern for most employers, if they have a good trained employee, to go out there and address the person straight on about the issue.
Well, that's spot on, Cliff. And from a non-legal point, I think that when people feel that they're being treated fairly and someone is actually listening to them, it de-escalates what's penned up. I mean, if you look at any explosive device, it's more effective within a container. And that's when it has the most effect. It has the most power. If you give someone the ability to express their feelings, that in itself many times will de-escalate it. And as Cliff just said, they may open up. You may not be able to ask them specific questions, but if someone wants to talk and be heard, then they're going to talk. And then from that point, you can help them out.
And the other thing we got to look at is we keep talking about supervisors, but their coworkers have to look out for each other as well. Often coworkers know before the supervisors that there's problems that should be brought to management's attention.
And I can't make it any clearer to a lot of people that I talk to that this is why you have a non-harassment policy. This is why you have a non-discrimination policy. It's just simple. If you have an anti-bullying, non-discrimination, non-harassment policy that's clear, it gives you a process of what it is that you're saying is not appropriate, of who to talk to, you will be able to go out there then, assess these things, and then you got to take prompt remedial measures to make sure that type of behavior doesn't happen in the future. Because if you allow that type of behavior to happen, it starts establishing two types of cultures. The first is acceptance by the company. The second is emboldenment of the individuals that are doing it. And so both of those tracks will result in being less likely to be reported, and your inability as an employer to be able to address things before they get to violence. Because if you have pent-up rage and you're emotional and you're just sick and tired of being sick and tired, what's the answer? If you're big enough, maybe you punch them. If you're not big enough, maybe you threaten them. And if you're just really, really fed up, who knows what you do? Do you get a gun? Do you get a weapon? Do you get friends to come meet that person at the gate when they're walking out? I mean, these are types of things, again, a policy does mean something. It does.
And that goes back to being careful who you hire also.
That's right.
On the front end. But having a clear, and I think to be able to do that, you have to have a clear list or a clear path of exactly who you talk to and who this issue is taken to. There's got to be a clear org chart on who will be responsible to move this forward so that we can come to some kind of resolutions. And the ultimate answer from management cannot be, well, if you don't like it here, don't let the door hit you, And
that goes to a great point that I brought up, and I think I've talked with Bob this several times. There is an initiative in a lot of places, from the local ordinance to states to federal governments with the EEOC, to not allow employers to do background checks until certain parts of the interview processes happen. And employers have fought back a little bit, saying, listen, if I'm going to be responsible for the actions of my employees when they get there, then I should be able to do a full vetting process to make sure that I'm dealing with somebody who doesn't have a criminal behavior or some sort of telltale sign to show me that they're going to be violent. Because, you want to give somebody a second chance, that's a great opportunity. But when you're in the hiring process and you find that somebody has a violent crime, whether it be punching somebody or hitting somebody, not something that's unrelated to your job, but if it's related to interacting with other people and it's a criminal offense that they've been convicted for, and then you hire the person and you put them into the workplace because you want to give them a chance, fine. But once that person gets into the workplace and they exhibit behavior that is threatening and intimidating, if you allow that individual, now that you know who they are, to continue to do that behavior, and eventually they hit somebody or hurt somebody, you have a higher likelihood of being sued for that type of behavior. And other employees are going to say, why am I not being put in a situation where I'm safe? Now, I'm not advocating that you not hire anybody who's got a criminal background or things like that. But what I'm saying is you have to be very careful when you're doing your vetting process, because there are claims that you can make for negligent hiring. There are claims that can be made for negligently retaining an employee. When you're aware of violent threats or violent tendencies or types of actions that are intimidating and harassing, and you let it happen, and you knew it should have been stopped, or you could have let it stop, and you had a policy you didn't enforce, or you didn't have a policy at all despite the fact this was going on, you're going to have problems as an employer. And there are times when people have hit multi-million dollar verdicts against employers, not for violence where somebody gets shot or killed, or people get choked, strangled, hit, assaulted at the workplace after they've been warned time after time. This is the type of employee we shouldn't have here anymore. Now, if you look at some of these rules, a zero tolerance policy for harassment is sometimes advocated even by these governments like OSHA and some of these other organizations for a reason, because what they want you to do is use the process, but when it's clear that the person poses a threat, you have an obligation to your other employees.
Well, I think that kind of lines up with domestic violence.
Sure.
And how many people, you can look at the statistics. You can look at, you can open up a newspaper, and I went and I filed charges, and they keep coming around, and I try to get a restraining order, but that doesn't work, and they're not picked up, and I call the police, and they don't take me seriously, and next thing, you see that someone is shot or strangled or killed, whatever, and I think it's on the same level, and it's great, and I think everybody deserves a second chance, but you have to understand that, okay, I'm giving them a second chance because, I know what I'm walking into. I know what the issues are. I want to give them a second chance because they want to turn their lives around, and that's good. But you have to look at your other employees also and balance that out.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. One of the things employers sometimes hang their hats on, and it depends on the state you're in, but a lot of workplace violence that happens could be covered under workers' comp statutes. And people say, well, what does that matter? From an employee standpoint, it's a big deal, because if I get hurt and I get workers' comp as my exclusive remedy, that means I may be barred from bringing a lawsuit against my employer. I get 80%, in a lot of places you get 80% of your pay and plus your insurance, but you don't get that big hit against the employer. And the employer say, you know what? I got a lot of employees. I can't do this. I got workers' comp. Don't worry about it. Well, you know what? It depends on what state you're in. Sometimes, in many states, if it's just one employee versus another employee on a one-on-one situation that's not related to their work, that workers' comp claim might not even be recognizable, and they might be able to go out against the employer. And if there's certain pre-existing negligent issues that happen where the employer knew about it, they still sue them. But sometimes employers say, well, you know what? I got myself covered. Don't worry about it. I've got workers' comp coverage, and then I got this corporate insurance. I'm good. But what we found over the years, if you take a look, there's actually some gaps sometimes in that insurance. And employers sometimes get in. And so if you think you're covered, you better find out if you are covered. So if you say, well, you know what, I can't do all that. I'm not going to do the individualized assessment. I'm too busy trying to get things done. I can't have this turnover because a guy's a hothead. I can't just let him go because of one issue. Or I'm hearing that they're a hothead because of some disability, so I'm between the crosshairs. Don't worry about it, I got insurance. Well, you better go check your policy, because sometimes there are gaps in your policies. So just make sure, if that's the game you're going to play, that you've got yourself covered. But there's still no coverage for the OSHA fines that might be out there too, potentially, if your insurance doesn't cover that.
Well, right, and I want to add on, Cliff, that it's from a financial point of view, from a legal point of view, spot on. But there has to be some moral thought put into this also, because yeah, okay, I'm covered, but someone's family is just destroyed. You know what I mean? Or someone's family is damaged, their ability to earn money or their ability to work, even beyond the financial, legal aspect of it, the personal aspect of it. And that's your responsibility also. Your responsibility is to protect your company financially, legally, but it's also has to be there to protect your workers from a moral standpoint. I think that it's clear, and I think there's a lot of situations that happen that should be covered under workplace violence that I think a lot of times goes under the table, and that's when someone says, okay, well, I don't want to get fired, so I'm not going to do anything within the workplace, but I know where someone lives, so 3 o'clock in the morning when they're sleeping, I'm going to do something. So these issues happen also that are related to workplace workplace violence also that I think goes underreported too.
And you got a duty to protect not only your employees, but your third-party vendors,
Yes.
customers. I mean, it depends on what type of industry you're in. Some places have more customers than others. Retail industry obviously has third parties all the time. And those people have premises liability rights. They have negligence rights. But they also just have dignity rights, to be protected as a person who comes in your store. So those are types of obligations that an employer has. It's type of expectations. I will say that there are some odd cases out there that say when you're making your rules and your policies, you got to think. You can't, again, don't put just a carte blanche, across the board policy saying, all people will be safe. When you start building expectations of safety into your workplace as opposed to trying to put measures that will make people safe, you may open up liabilities on yourself. So be careful how you word your policies and what you say in those policies so that they're done properly, and don't open yourself up to needless litigation where you can just address the problem.
Right, and there's always going to be things that are outside your ability to control them.
Sure.
I mean, that's the bottom line. You just have to do your due diligence, protect the company, make sure that you're protected from liability. You have your policy in place, and you follow up with your policy, and you do everything you can to actually know the people that are working for you. But there's not anything that's just completely foreseeable that you can protect people.
And so we talked about 2 million incidents in the workplace every year in the U.S., 400 fatalities in the U.S. With 400 fatalities in the U.S., unfortunately, the thinking is it only matters if it happens here. But the idea is to prepare now. You can't help yourself after the incident happens, right? So what we need to start pushing out there, and that's one of the things that we're working on with the programs we're putting together, is getting people prepared now, just like you would for a fire drill, just like you would for a tornado drill. There are things you can do now. How's your security? I did a training the other day, just launched our more modern version of our workplace violence training. And when we were talking about putting cameras up, you could hear the employees in the background and the sighs, right? Because what's the first thing an employee thinks when you're putting cameras up?
You're trying to watch me,
get
rid of me, right?
You're trying to watch me. And my suggestion was, hey, listen, get the employees involved. I had employees and managers in on this training, so it was really productive. Get the employees involved. Where do they feel insecure? What areas of the plant or facility do they have where they feel that they need to have cameras? That way, frankly, anybody that's ever been in a high position is not spending their day looking at a camera. They're spending their day worrying about growing their business, first of all. Second of all, if you do have the cameras, it is for the protection of the employees. It's protection of themselves, the firm, the company, right? When I did that presentation and we suggested working together as a group, you could hear the attitude change like instantly in the room.
But that's exactly it, Bob. We used to call that common sense. You involve everybody in the process, so they're not just having to adhere to the policy or whatever changes are made. They're part of it.
Yeah, and that's what's required, I think, of anybody who wants to do a real policy. You want to have a workplace violence prevention program, you got to have buy-in.
Yeah.
And Rick, you told, everybody, I think, understands this, but you talked about it. Look, you got to listen. You got to listen to people. If you're not out there actively engaging from a frontline management all the way up to the top into what employees are saying, you can't actually implement changes that mean anything. Who are you getting your information from? What are the assessments that you're doing? You got one person walking around telling you? How about the people who work there every day, who hear and feel what's really going on? If they say, you know what, I'd like to have some cameras up here. I'd like to have maybe an extra manager in this area. I don't feel safe over here. Can we put some lights up over there? How about that? How about listening to people? And that's part of your plan. Your annualized or quarterly plan should put employees in that discussion. That's really what you want to do. That's taking real measures to ensure you have a safe environment.
Well, you have to involve the people. Everybody has to be on the same team. And if you don't do that, then you're never going to have a comprehensive, safety program, where people feel protected. Everybody's got to be part of it. I think Bob said earlier, the co-workers are responsible also. But if the co-workers aren't they're not part of the process, if they don't understand what the process is, or if there even is a process, then they're not going to do anything. They have to have ownership of it also to really care about it. And that goes from every aspect. And you hit it spot on, Cliff. It goes from every aspect of how you manage your people. Your employees, your team members have to be involved in it. Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, and having them involved will take away that phenomenon that back when I was a firefighter, we'd take part in a lot of fire drills, right? And one of the things that we see is as soon as we pull the fire drill, nobody's moving at their fastest. Many people stay in their offices. It's just a fire drill. I mean, they didn't know if it was real or not. If you have involvement with the employees and they have a sense of urgency and they understand that this isn't a game, that this is something that we have to take seriously, odds are they are going to react the way they are appropriately supposed to act.
Well, Bob, just like when you were a firefighter, if someone has a heart attack in their home, it's so much better if there's someone there that can start the life-saving procedures while you're waiting for the ambulance and the fire engine truck to get there.
Absolutely.
And the firefighter. I mean, have someone start the process. Okay, we're coming, but we're not there now. So, start the life-saving process right now. And as soon as we get there, we'll take over. But, give us a few minutes to get there. Nothing is instant.
Yeah,
Well, but Bob, the key here is we think of guns. We hear workplace violence. Everybody sees that gun, okay? And they think, all right, let's do our active shooter training. And now people will probably buy into that, right? People will say, hey, I don't want to be shot. I don't want to be killed. Tell me, what do I need to do? So if a company goes out and does that type of training, people like that.
But what happens, how do you stop that from getting to that point?
No, but the point is even more, let's just say, okay, now fire drills. I think people get conditioned from the time they're kids that this is a drill. It's not really safe. Over time you see it so much, they don't really buy into it. It's just something you got to do. And then you lack that investment of the individual. That's the problem, is that some people at the top end, when it's really serious, they'll do it. When they don't feel that it means anything, they don't buy in, and that's the problem with this harassment policy and these less than deadly violence issues. You see employees not engage as much in the process because they don't think they're part of the process. They don't take it as seriously. You've got to get your employees engaged on that level.
They understand the importance of it. Now, Cliff, tell me something. If someone had seen a fire where people got burned up and either saw it personal or on a video and training, they're going to take it a lot more personal or the urgency a lot more than if it was just a regular thing and they weren't educated on why they're actually doing it. It's like anything else. Why are we doing this? Because of a fire. Well, okay, because of a fire. They don't think of it, but when they see the damage that it can do, that's when they start to say, well, that could be me. Mm-hmm. And that's when people personalize it. And the same thing with a shooting. If you just talk about shootings, or you talk about any situation that's potentially harmful, if people don't look at, well, that could be me, then they don't take it important. And that's why the training and the intensity of the training is so important, because you have to personalize it to everybody before they take it seriously.
And that's why rolling out your policies on non-harassment, on anti-violence, needs to be something that's not just, here's your piece of paper, sign it. It's got to feel real. And your trained supervisors, management officials, if people on the floor see that somebody comes forward with it, it's investigated, and somebody either gets fired or they get written up or they don't see the person anymore, whatever it is, if they see real tangible effects, all of a sudden it becomes real to them. It becomes something that they can actually hang their hat on. You got to get that type of engagement. That's why I say the zero tolerance for intimidation, threats, and harassment. The real life disciplinary nature, the counseling nature has to be real, and you have to take it serious. People have got to believe that you're taking it serious, or they won't.
I remember when, as a union official, and there were times when I was in steel mills or with truck drivers and in hospitals, whatever, and I see people doing foolish, unsafe things, like in a steel mill, walking under one of those big crane hooks, and it could weigh hundreds, if not thousands of pounds. And areas where you're designated to walk and not walk, and you always have to have your hard hat on. And you see people who, and I've seen people who have walked in those areas and without a helmet on or without even looking or because they become so familiar with where they're at, they no longer, feel the danger or feel the need to watch out for their surroundings. And I've seen that before, and I would call the local rep and say, get over here and talk to this person and show him why that he has to follow these procedures. Show him whether it's in a video, talk to him, but you have to re-educate him and make him, understand why his surroundings are so important, because your life can change in a second. Mm-hmm. Your ability to provide for your family can change in a second. Your ability to breathe on your own can change in a second. And the same thing with these safety policies, and the same thing with the violence issues that we're talking about today. Your life can change in a second. But people understanding that, the importance of that and how it could affect them and their family and their loved ones and their ability to provide for their family is something that has to be kept up, kept in a high level of importance.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we've been on a lot of jobs where we've witnessed it firsthand, and it could have easily spun out of control to a tragic level. In fact, I remember getting that one phone call at midnight about a man with a gun in his glove box. And, thank God we had somebody on the ground that knew how to de-escalate that and get the police involved. And that's the other thing. People, they're afraid to call the police a lot of the times. And that's what they're there for. You gotta know when the right time to call the police is. And frankly, the zero tolerance to me means zero tolerance, Cliff, by the way. If I own a company and my money and my livelihood's invested in it, and employees are getting into a fist fight, it's not worth the risk for me.
Yeah, there's always variables. I mean, there always are, people defending themselves against somebody who's the aggressor in those situations. And so we don't want to have this idea that if two people are in a fight, they both are wrong. But quite honestly, unless you have some very specific exception that you can really hang your hat on that makes sense, and I mean something that's ironclad, yeah, zero tolerance should say zero tolerance. Otherwise, why have a policy that says zero tolerance if it doesn't mean it?
Well, you can't say zero tolerance and then don't have the backup on the ground. So someone who is faced with an issue that maybe physical or non-physical can go to. Right. Okay, if you have the ability, if someone on the ground is feeling threatened, whether it's physically or non-physically, and you don't have the ability for them to go to somebody to address it, and they're just on their own, well, they're going to have to protect themselves, and that's why the follow-up is that you have to have that strong policy, but also have the ability to address those situations when they come up. And I'm not talking about a month later, a week later, but rapidly be able to address those issues on the floor.
I mean, you'll see a time where maybe there are two coworkers and there's either, there's some sort of love triangle that's going on, okay? And all of a sudden there's a fight on the floor. And a lot of times what you'll see is the employer say, well, this is just something that's outside of work. It didn't have anything to do with the job. These are really good employees. I can't lose these two employees. I know we have a zero tolerance policy, but come on. This isn't the thing that I should really call the police on or discipline these guys for. And you have to start thinking to yourself, well, if you don't discipline that, who are you going to discipline? Doesn't everybody have an excuse? I mean, there has to be some sort of policy that means something even when the reason seems to be good. Now, again, self-defense is one thing. Somebody walks up to somebody, they're minding their own business, they punch them on the head, and they just hit to get out of the situation and move away because the person's really going to have an imminent threat. Right. Yeah, okay, that's one thing. But two people just come in there and they start arguing, and they go back and forth, and then they fight. Well, you either have a zero-tolerance policy in that situation or you don't. You either suspend them both, and that's what you're going to do in the next situation, or you're not. Because once you start drawing these lines, people start expecting that they'll get a break too.
That or the workers around them will start feeling like they're working in an atmosphere of fear.
Sure.
Because if they're allowed to do that to that one person, who's to say they're not allowed to come after them at a later point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean and now you have Johnny Johnny's been in a fight, and he fought with a guy who was dating his ex-wife. And you say, well, they were going through a divorce, and that just happened, and these things happen. And then Johnny goes out and punches Paul, who took some overtime from him. Now what are you going to do now? Now, Paul's sitting there going, you knew this is the kind of guy when he gets upset about anything, he'll just fly off the handle and punch. Now, I think this is unfair, and I think I should go after you guys, and I'm going to start looking at my options. And then next thing you know, Johnny goes out there and punches somebody else who parked in his spot. I mean, at some point in time, you have a notice. You're on notice of somebody's propensity for violence.
Well, that's one of those situations where 2 years down the road, you say, I should have stopped it back then. Yeah. But the bottom line is this: either policy means something or it means nothing. Mm-hmm. So if you make a policy, then don't make a policy you're not willing to uphold and adhere to. If it either means something or it means nothing.
Yes. So to wrap it up, I mean, we've seen a lot on TV. We're seeing the school shootings. We saw what happened in Las Vegas. And there were some bombings in Austin, I believe, not too long ago. What was it, last week?
Yeah, I think so.
So we're seeing these things on the TV. So it is creating a hypersensitive awareness. As tragic as they are, it now is the time to start the discussion in the workplace and redesign, as we always say, your corporate DNA, and put the prevention of these kind of actions into that corporate DNA. And that starts with the training. It starts with drills. But it's very, very important that you don't wait on that. You get it done now, because if you don't have it done and something tragic happens, you're going to regret that for a long, long time.
And you know what, Bob? I think it's something that's very tangible. I think that it is even beyond the moral, the legal issues. I think it's just smart business, because when your workers feel that you care about them, then they're going to care more also.
I would like to say, though, we talk about workplace violence here because the most prevalent workplace violence is the non-deadly workplace violence. And that's why it's important to put this first. This is the important concept that, Bob, you hit right on it. There are a lot of big picture things we see on the news, but what we see on the work floor most of the time are these issues. We're talking the 2 million instances that people don't think are being addressed. That's the problem you have, that you might have a serious day-to-day consequence for. Now, when you put your weapons policy into place, you need to be very careful, because every state has its own rules on weapons policies and how you should make them. The carte blanche across the board works in some states, but other states say that you can bring a gun locked in your car. Some states say you can do it while you're in the scope of your employment, but what's the scope of your employment? So when you draft those policies to talk about and address that, make sure you do it right, make sure you do it effectively, make sure you enforce it, but that's just part of your process for violence. Get yourself ready for the worst case scenario. Get yourself ready for the worst problems you could think of, but get yourself ready for the day-to-day problems that are already in existence, and get yourself prepared with a policy, a plan, and annualized training.
And you know what, Cliff? I think that a lot of people would be surprised that it's not just the gun locked in the back in someone's trunk or the back of someone's truck that scares them. Is people actually having them on their hip in the work facility, and that happens a lot.
Well, one of the things Cliff and I were talking about before you got here is he has a matrix. And here in Michigan, the employer has the ultimate say-so. An employer can say, you absolutely can have your if you have a permit, you can have your gun in the facility.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, and I mean, some states, Michigan's one of them, it's open carry state. And there are a lot of advocates for that. And there are a lot of employers who don't care one way or the other, or haven't taken a stand. They don't have a policy one way or the other.
They don't care until there's an issue.
That's right.
They don't care until there's an issue.
Right. And even if you didn't, there are people who have licenses to carry, and those licenses allow you to do certain things with those weapons. And without a policy, an employer, like in Michigan, for instance, you can prohibit somebody, even with a license, from coming and going into the work facility, obviously. But there are some issues about you can't stop one of your employees from going out and getting a license. Now, other states, they don't have any policy at all in there, no rules whatsoever. And if you're a public employer versus a private employer, there are different rules. State government, local government, schools, they all have different rules. You have to be very careful about how you address employees on this issue. Know what you're talking about before you do it. But the number one thing is there are states that say that you can't do anything. You actually cannot stop people from bringing their guns into work. There actually are states like that. There are states that say you absolutely can. There are states that have nothing on the books. As an employer, you need to assess what states you work in and what your rules say you can and can't do. And then you assess, okay, here's a policy I want, here's the risk, and I'm taking this, and this is going to be our policy.
And I think that, just like you said, Cliff, it's so important to understand what your local laws say that you can and cannot do, and then make the best policy from that point.
Culture's changing right now, and now is the best time for, we do have awareness happening now. We do see, on a grand stage, tragedies happening, but as Cliff said, now is the time where we can look at every aspect of workplace violence and start addressing that issue and make that part of a culture change nationwide. And we can suggest it as consultants and attorneys, but ultimately it's up to the employers to embrace it, and that's what we're here today. We want this message to get out to everyone, to workers, to employers, to anyone that will listen. Now's the time to make the change.
We have the data, Bob. We know what's going on for the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Yeah. We have the data. There's no excuse not to step up to the plate.
Hopefully we'll get the impact we wanted to. This was great talk. A little bit different than the PSLabor talks we've done in the past, but we all agreed that this was a very important issue. I hope that everybody takes a little bit of this and actually goes out there and makes some change. Rick, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you.
Cliff, thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next time on PSLabor Talk.